Well, hello, Developing Leaders class for the fall of 2020. Dr. Martinez and I are really enjoying working with you and having you as a class. Here we want to do a presentation on the landscape of leadership theory. So having looked outward at kind of the terrain in which we are learning how to lead, these are the tools that are provided theoretically for leadership, kind of an overview of some of them, and then looking specifically at two of them. Usually our content presentation, you could call it lectures, is both more interactive and also more shared. We have not figured out yet in this medium of asynchronous and synchronous dispersed learning how to share content both at the same time. So I'm doing most of the content interaction, and then really we're used to a more fluid, interactive way to do it with the class as well. And so we really look forward to the Thursdays when we get to hear from you about what you're learning, the kinds of questions that you are having for this kind of material. So landscape of leadership theory, what does it look like, is what we want to spend a few minutes here thinking through with you. Broadly speaking, there are a number of significant leadership texts. So Peter Northhouse's Leadership Theory and Practice, it's in its 8th edition. It's been a standard text that's used a lot of different places. Gail Avery has a text called Understanding Leadership. Afsana Nevada has a text called The Art and Science of Leadership in a 7th edition. And Andrew Dubrin has Leadership, which is research findings and then practices and skills. It's also, I think, in its 9th edition. So a number of significant theorists that have gathered up a lot of work. And besides these kinds of books, there are just innumerable articles on leadership. Our intention isn't for you to know all of what's in these books as much as it is for you to know the breadth and significance of the leadership literature that's available to you. And I just want to say a few words actually about two of these, Dr. Nava Hamdi's and also Gail Avery's, and then I'll just touch on Dr. Northhouse's and Dr. Dubrin's. So Gail Avery, when she's looking at the landscape of leadership theory, describes 4 paradigms of leadership. So she talks about classical leadership, transactional leadership, visionary leadership, and organic leadership. So different kinds of leadership. Classical leadership, sources of power are position, reward, coercion, so the ability to have force in the leadership, high control leaders, traditional organizational structures to support this. From her work, you could think most government. From me, I would say the structure of most of our denominations is actually structured along these ways. It's a systemic issue for us because we want to think differently often, but we've structured ourselves pretty much like this. There's what she's called transactional leadership. Leaders manage the environment to influence followers. There are negotiated agreements, commonly what's known as a psychological contract. So these aren't physical contracts, but where it's kind of understanding of if the leader acts in this way, then the followers, the other people are given a certain benefit psychologically. Often the leader's views prevails after consultation. I think lots of our congregations function like this, particularly if you think collectively about a vestry or a parish, a board or a session, that after those leaders consult with the congregation, their views prevail. Then there's visionary leadership. The leader's charisma, shared vision inspires followers. Multiple views, maybe one prevails. I think Elon Musk is probably kind of our broadest, vision of this. And sometimes congregations function like this, particularly new church starts, and sometimes when a pastor is particularly visionary. And then she talks about organic leadership, the focus on the group who share the sense-making and responsibility. I think Google for this. Lots of denominations and congregations, in my view, want to be this. So she divides leadership into kind of four models, 4 ways that people go about leadership. Afsana Navandi talks about eras of leadership, and she says from the late 1800s to the mid-1940s, there was the trait era of leadership. And in that era, they said leaders are made, not born. It was the era of leader heroes. You might have heard of the great men theory of history, where you tell the history theory. You tell history by focusing on George Washington, and then Monroe, and then Abraham Lincoln. And then, you kind of go through and they're in those men, but that's why I call it the great men. And it's widely, I would say, that vision of history and thus of leadership is pretty well debunked. I mean, it's far more complex than that, but there is a shared kind of understanding of how you describe the world and also how you describe leaders, which there often actually is that kind of linkage. Then from the 1940s to the 1970s, what was called the behavior era. And this is where the focus shifted from kind of who the leader is to what the leader does. And so rather than saying leaders are born, not made, we started to say leaders are made, not born. And there could be skill assessments and people could learn these behaviors. It eventually was seen as too simplistic, but it did tell us this, that task and relationship, and this is from Dr. Navahandi, she says that task and relationship behaviors are primary behaviors, that's what leaders do. So there's ways that we see things emerge even from each of these eras. The truth is, according to the literature, the research, there are some traits that do better in terms of leadership. People who are more sociable, people who are more lively. Sometimes the word aggressive or assertive is used in certain environments do better in terms of how that group wants to be led. But it's not about traits. It's not just about certain behaviors. We eventually got from the 1960s to the present into the contingency era, where it depends on the situation. There's no one best way to lead. We got to keep learning, and context matters. Now, turning from that to Northouse and Duprin, I just want to note that when Northouse divides things up, he talks about a trait approach to leadership, a skills approach to leadership, a behavior approach to leadership, and a situational approach to leadership, which you'll notice that overlap with Navahandi's, her eras, and Northouse says similar things. He goes on to talk about transformational, authentic, servant, and adaptive leadership, which I'm going to talk about in just a little bit, and he talks about followership. Andrew Duprin talks about traits of leadership, charismatic leadership, leadership behaviors, and contingency leadership, which he also calls situational leadership, and then he talks about ethics, power, and teamwork. What I want you to see is the overlap among these main theorists about talking about traits and saying it's not really, they all say leaders are not born, that's clear to them, although that's been the history of the theory. It's kind of started there. They talk about skills, behaviors. Sometimes they divide those two. Sometimes they put those two things together, behaviors being a little bit more innate, skills being more things that we do. And then they go on to talk about situational leadership, contingency leadership, this idea that context matters and that in different contexts, different leadership behaviors or skills are required. And then starting to get into these conversations about followership, ethics, power, and teamwork. Almost all of them have that kind of traditional definition of leadership. The leader is the person who helps the group do what they've commonly agreed upon. Sometimes it's commonly agreed upon, but the group helps people accomplish a task. And that's important. Actually, Gail Avery is the one exception to that, where she says, there's so many definitions of leadership that's one of the things we've got to grapple with, and she's probably the most kind of complex and you might call it, say, supple in terms of dealing with that. We want to introduce you to two specific leadership theories. One about emotionally intelligent leadership and another about adaptive leadership, because these are examples of kind of what you could call late modern leadership theory. The emotional intelligent leadership very much fits into, you call this kind of skills behavior approach with some awareness of situation. And I'll say just a little bit about that. And then Ronald Heifetz's adaptive leadership is very much kind of situational contingency type understanding of leadership. So a consulting firm, and that tells us something already, Hay McBriar, did a random sample of almost 4,000, 3,900 executives selected from a database of more than 20,000 executives worldwide. So I just want to say a few things about this. First of all, this would be considered decent sociological research. I mean, it's a large sample size. It's done well. It's done by professionals. It's also, and we'll come back and talk about this, done as is much of this work done in kind of the business world and even the for-profit world. And that matters in terms of our own interaction with it. It's quantitative research. That's also a kind of a world that tells something. They're dealing with numbers. They believe the world can be quantified. And the focus is on what leadership produces results. Again, that tells us something about what we're going to get out of here. They found, as they did this, 6 different leadership styles. And I'll say this and I'll come back to it. They say the best leaders can choose from among different styles for different contexts. So you see that situational approach, but you can also see that behavior approach, the skilled approach underlying that, with an understanding that we're choosing. Here's the styles. They said, and what they said is all these styles have a place, and every style needs to be used in some situations. There's what they call a coercive style, where a leader demands immediate compliance, wants people to do what I tell you, and then they said this comes most naturally to people who have high levels of a drive to achieve, initiative, and self-control. And they said it works best in a crisis to kickstart a turnaround and deal with problematic people / employees. They do say the overall impact on an organizational climate is, and you can't quite read that under me, is negative. So too much coercive leadership, not good. Sometimes we say, thinking about this, think of a surgeon where, a surgeon says, hand me scalpel number 7, and no one says back to the surgeon, are you sure you want that one? What about this? Why don't you do this next? You want immediate compliance. And of course, that's a crisis when there's surgery going on. It's a chosen crisis. Like, this has to be done, and this kind of style works well in that kind of a situation. Also, on a Sunday morning, if someone during worship all of a sudden has a major health issue, people want a coercive style of leadership. They want someone to say, here's what we do. You all go here, you call 911. But if too much of that happens, it's overall negative on a climate. There's an authoritative style. Sorry, that got a little divided there, but authoritative. This mobilizes people toward a vision. It says to people, come with me. So rather than telling people what to do, the leader's going a place and bringing people along. People with high levels of self-confidence, empathy, so they're more attuned to other people, enjoy being a change catalyst. Works best when change requires a new vision or when clear direction is needed. So this is when something needs to be different. This is strongly positive. People respond well to this done well, particularly if the direction turns out to be right and hopeful. So we've got a coercive style, an authoritative style, and now an affiliative style. The affiliative style works to create harmony and build emotional bonds. It says to people, people come first. So you notice we're not going someplace. It's not the task. It's not a crisis. People comes first. People who have high levels of empathy, people who enjoy building relationships, skilled at communication, do well with this affiliative style. It does best when there's rifts in a team or to motivate people in stressful situations. So when things are hard, this affiliative style works. It has a positive impact on organizational climate. There's a democratic style, works to forge consensus through participation, involves people. It says to what do you think? People who enjoy collaboration, team leadership, again, communication. Most helpful to get buy-in, to get input from valuable employees. And just to remind you, this is language from a consulting company, which I left in here because it flavors our understanding of it. Again, positive. I would say this style shows up quite frequently in particularly mainline congregations, at least the members of the congregation, their expectation, they want to be involved, and there's this expectation there's going to be participation, consensus, and we're going to go into this together. There's a pace-setting style, sets high standards of performance, says to people, do as I do now. If you're conscientious, if you want to achieve, if you've got initiative, this works. This works well to get high results from an already highly motivated or competent team. The example we sometimes use for this is, if you're getting ready to lead Sunday morning on an Easter Sunday and there's a choir and you go into the choir and you say, let's do it today. Let's give everything we've got and point people to the hope we have in Jesus Christ. People respond well to that. They're ready to do it. They're excited to do it. What we know, though, is that if people do that week after week after week, eventually it's got a negative impact. People can't sustain those kinds of demands on kind of give it all, give it all, give it all, give it all now. But there are times when it really, really helps. And finally, a coaching style, working to develop people for the future, saying to people, try this, I'll be with you. If people who enjoy developing others, more empathy, self-awareness, you can see that some of these are turned towards people, some of these are turned towards tasks, all necessary. This is positive when a leader cares about other people. What they say is that, and this is what they say, is leadership is choosing the proper style and enacting it to move the organizational forward. They say all these styles are necessary in different contexts. The best people, best leaders use 4 of them. Most people report having access to 2. So I just want to think with you about that in terms of what that means in terms of leadership. If most of us naturally have or kind of fit into 2 of those, but it takes all 6, that immediately points towards teams, it points towards growth, and maybe we can get to 4, and it points towards contextual understanding so that we can know what is necessary in a certain place. And then if that's not what we do, find the person or the people who can help do that. What they say is that knowing our strengths, and they work particularly with emotional intelligence, and that would be the other book that we pointed you to, working on emotional intelligence builds the ability to move among styles, that we're not so focused on our own anxieties, but we're able to kind of see clearly what needs to happen and then be able to choose how to move towards that. You know, in terms of just evaluating this, we want to say that we appreciate its contextuality and that it works to recognize the complexity of life and to move in the midst of that. It itself is contextual. It's done in a for-profit world that gives it certain language. It gives it a certain focus. Results are the job. And that immediately jumps us to the fact that being contextual, it also is culturally bound. The Western corporate story, which is what it lives in, what we recognize is that we will and do also live in that story, and there can be some overlapping language, even if we don't buy into everything that's underneath of it. I want to note to you, this is pretty non-metaphorical, and by that I mean it's not image-based. It doesn't tend to stick in people's heads the way good metaphors do, and it does not directly relate, or I think there's some question about how it relates to the biblical story. How does it relate to how does a performative leader relate to a Jesus who calls 12 disciples who are often a mess? I mean, it raises those kinds of questions for us. You also, as we mentioned, will need to think theologically about God's agency in and through these kinds of theories, and particularly, in my mind, in this kind of a theory where human agency is all over the place and it's functionally atheistic. I mean, it doesn't expect God to be at work. There's no talk of forgiveness and what we mean by biblical forgiveness. There's no talk of the Holy Spirit being at work. And in terms of the type of leadership that creates a new world, one that has not yet been imagined, in our minds we need more than this. That there's strength in this kind of a theory, and it's good for us to know it and to see kind of what the skills can be needed in a certain situation. It's kind of necessary but not sufficient because it helps us get results in the world we've got. It does not help us think about what's the world ahead. So that's that theory of leadership, and that's emotionally intelligent leadership. And it's a theory about what are the traits that are necessary and how do they come to be. I also want to say a few words about adaptive leadership, which is leadership called without easy answers. It comes from a theorist named Ronald Heifetz, who is a lecturer and a leader in public leadership, and he's the founder of the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. Again, that tells us a few things. It tells us something about where he is, the type of thinking he's doing. He's thinking actually a little bit more on the nonprofit side, but he's in the social sector, but he's also thinking about government. He's thinking about how the world works and fits together. There's some affinities that we've got in terms of that and some questions that we'll bring to that. He's a physician and a cellist and says that he brings insights from both of those fields to thinking about leadership. I think it's good to know people's backgrounds. Here's someone who thinks musically, who's worked in a symphony, who thinks about a group coming together and the necessity of all those different parts, who also thinks medically and also metaphorically. In the early 1990s, so this goes back a few years, he started asking and thinking about leadership, authority, and tackling very, very hard problems. And he's problem-focused, and that's a question that some other theorists would ask him about in terms of a kind of a core approach. That's what he was thinking about. If you go back and read the books, particularly The Leadership Without Easy Answers, it talks about some social issues that were really highly present in 1994. Actually, some issues of race. There were some riots going on. Rodney King, some of you would remember that. And he tells some of those stories and interacts with some of those challenges. And then he went on with another person, Marty Linklead, to write Leadership on the Line. They've gone on, added other people to practice of adaptive leadership and continue to kind of grow their own thinking. Those books are now considered leadership classics, particularly in mainline denominations. You'll hear reference to adaptive leadership, and I'll say a little word about that because I think there are some ways that we naturally draw on this and some ways that we push it aside when it's convenient for us. He changed the conversation. This is why this one's so important. He changed the conversation about leadership from moving us from talking about vision, and some of you maybe have been around leadership enough to know the leaders, this conversation about the leader's the person with the vision, the leader's the person who knows what to do. Well, he shifted that to adaptive leadership, and he advanced leadership conversation. He introduced the topics like what do we do when we don't know what to do? What do groups do when they don't know what to do? And he helped us talk directly about the dangers and costs of genuine leadership. Before him, lots of leadership literature just made leadership sound like it was grand fun, and maybe it was hard, or maybe it was only for the special few, but it was wonderful. And he came along and said, leadership's got costs, and there's actually dangers and traps that leaders fall into. Help advance the conversation that way. His key concept was adaptive leadership. Is adaptive leadership? He says that adaptive leadership is the learning required to address conflicts in the values people hold, or to diminish the gap between the values people stand for and the reality people face. So there's some sense that we have got lots of values, and sometimes those values are in conflict with one another. So in congregations, this often seems readily apparent when people will say, do you want to reach out? And people say, oh, of course, we value new people. That's a deep value of ours. And then maybe the pastor will say, well, in that case, we need to really change the sanctuary so that it's readily available for the people in the area. Or the pastor will say, in that case, we need a worship service in a different language because that's the area of this, of where we are right now. And people go, whoa, well, we've got to value that that this place stays the same as well. And those things are in conflict with one another. Adaptive work, he says, requires a change in values, beliefs, or behaviors. And so notice how this is shifting the conversation from kind of like, well, what do we do, to even how we get along, to what are core values that people hold. And then he says, here's what leadership is: the exposure and orchestration of conflict within individuals and constituencies to mobilize people to learn new ways. And still is for a lot of people a different understanding of how to think about leadership. He says it doesn't replace the image of leadership as a visionary activity. It places emphasis on the act of giving clarity and articulation of the community's guiding values. That's what's got to be there for people. Neither providing a map for the future that disregards value conflicts, nor providing an easy way out that neglects the facts will suffice for leadership. And he also advocated for leadership, kind of this naming reality, what's really going on in our context, in kind of the area around us. There's a little chart. He would say there's technical work and there's adaptive work. A technical work called type 1 work, where the problem's clear, the solution is clear, and then the leader does the work. So one of the examples for this is if I have an earache, I go to the doctor, and the doctor looks in my ear, and then the doctor says, you know what? You have something in your ear. Like there's something in there, let's take it out. Or the doctor says, you've got an ear infection, here's a pill. So the problem's clear, the solution is clear, the leader, the doctor's the one that knows what we're doing. And Heifetz says there are situations like that, and that's technical work. We need that done. Then there's a combination, type 2 work, that's technical and adaptive. The problem's clear, but maybe the solution requires some learning. So we know what to do. So say a congregation says, yes, it's clear. We're going to start a new worship service. We've got it. We've got to learn how to do that. And then people need to learn how to do that. And then what he says is there's lots more of this kind of stuff than we realize, but there's this adaptive type 3 work where even the problem requires learning. And then, of course, the solution's going to require learning. And then leader and people are the focus. So a diagnosis, so I've got heartish, my heart hurts or my chest hurts. I go and we've got to learn, is the problem a blocked artery? Or is the problem even deeper than that? The problem is that I need to change my eating habits. Well, even figuring out that kind of problem at its deepest level requires learning. The doctor can't do all of that for me. The solution is going to require learning, particularly if it is a change in habits, if the values of managing anxiety through eating cake and living a long life to be with my grandkids, those two values come into collision, then that's adaptive work, according to Heifetz. And it happens individually, it happens on a grand scale. To get to this, he says we've got to differentiate between leadership and authority. And what he says, this is kind of his theory, that social systems depend on systems of authority. Authority confirms power in order to perform a service. It can be given or taken away. It's conferred as a part of an exchange. And so what he says is that for leaders, what happens to leaders of authority is that we've been given power to perform a service. And as long as we're doing that, then we continue to have power. So a church hires a pastor, and as part of that confirms power on that person. It says, yeah, we want you to preach for us. And that can be given or taken away. And the understanding is, though, then that as the person with power, we help the institution move into the future. In stressful situations, what he says is we look to authority to help us. So we want the person to whom we've given power to help us with the issues that we have. But sometimes that is a challenge for us. If we're leading with authority, then authority has the responsibility for direction, protection, and order for an organization. In distress, people look towards authority to solve problems and help. But we've got mixed feelings about authority based on our experience with authority. And what he says, though, is authority can be helpful in dealing with technical work. So when there's technical work to be done, authority is good for us. When congregations want to know how to set up new employees with benefits, then they look to the stated clerk of the presbytery to come in and say, here's how you do it. And that's a helpful thing to them when someone can come and say, here's what you're working on, here's how to do these things, and that works. Authority, though, has a big challenge in dealing with adaptive work because leaders with authority are responsible for the future of an organization, and the conversation itself might be challenging for the future of an organization. So there's a conflict and there's a challenge for genuine adaptive leadership, particularly with authority. Exercising leadership from a position of authority means going against the grain. It's not about fulfilling expectations, which is see how leaders with authority get to stay in authority, but providing questions, letting people feel threats, sometimes disorienting people so that new relationships develop, generating conflict, challenging norms, risky behavior for leaders with authority is what Heifetz says. And that's new in the leadership conversation as he says that kind of stuff. Leadership without authority gives the ability to ask harder questions. Sometimes those people can see more clearly. They've got more flexibility. They can see other perspectives. But if you try to lead without authority, you can be vulnerable because you don't have as much power in the system. And Heifetz is all kind of working at naming that for people. It means that adaptive leadership, whether with authority or without authority, is identifying an adaptive challenge, saying, here's what's really going on, regulating distress. So what he says is, see, adaptive leadership isn't going to solve problems. Sometimes it's going to raise the awareness, say to people, this is really a big issue. If we don't solve this, we're not going to have a solution to it. Maintain disciplined attention. He's got a great section about work avoidance, and he says we're masters at work avoidance, but we've got to maintain disciplined attention and give the work back to the people. This is the key. I think this is something that in the mainline settings where I hear this talked about, people miss a lot. But he says adaptive leadership gives work back to people, doesn't do the work for them. We often want to solve problems. We want to be seen as the people who have the answers, and we feel like if we're the leader, particularly with authority, that's our job. He says you got to give the work back to people. It's risky because it can lead to values that don't have the same values that we've got. But he says it's got to be done if you want adaptive work to be done. And then he says we got to get off the dance floor and onto the balcony. We're the ones who reflect, and we reflect on the relationships that are going on. And then he says we apply power, sometimes with authority, sometimes without authority, but looking at power relationships is key for adaptive leadership. It's hard. We'll come back to this in a week, but he says staying alive in leadership's a challenge. We got to manage our hungers. We got to anchor ourselves. We have to distinguish between role and self. We need partners. Listen to ourselves when we find a sanctuary. And we'll say more about that next week. As a reminder, our goals are at some level for you to know and apply theory. You're a better leader because your encounter with content, you understand it. It shapes your understanding of the world. We'd say that's the seminar level. We also want you to understand history and context of theory. That's maybe the undergraduate level. You can describe the main players of theory, how it came to be, compare it to other theories, understanding how it's kind of, there's a trajectory of moving through this kind of stuff, and there's building blocks that go on. And then we want you to learn the skills to develop a constructive and critical understanding of theory. We think that's master's work. At that level, you know the strengths and weaknesses of a theory. You can apply it in a contextual way to yourself and your organization. We think it's not possible to jump levels. You've got to know it. You've got to understand it in its context, and then we can get to that. So that's something for us to continue to think about and talk about. A little definition of leadership from Heifetz and Linsky at the end. It's an activity of mobilizing people to tackle tough challenges, do the adaptive work necessary to achieve progress and thrive. That's their definition of leadership. We look forward to seeing you on Thursday.